And if you're quiet, things you cannot put into words, yet you still know. You walk into a room and the atmosphere has already changed. You sense a strange vibration, not from voices, but from the tension in someone's gaze, from the odd silence that greets your arrival. No one says anything, but you know. You know they are afraid. Not afraid of you, but of the light of truth you've just brought in. From that moment on, they are no longer in control of the situation. You don't need to accuse them. You don't need to expose them. You only need to know, and for them to know that you know. They don't run. They react. Through an unusual silence or excessive sweetness. Through fabricating more lies to cover the old ones. Through turning you into someone overly sensitive while they play innocent, as if they've done nothing wrong. But the most dangerous part isn't in their behavior. It lies here. If you're not fully awake, you'll think you're the one going mad. In today's video, we'll explore 7 common reactions from harmful individuals when their mask starts to crack, and they realize you're no longer blind. Part 1. 7 signs evil people show when they know you know. 1. They emit a strange kind of energy. Deception doesn't begin with words. It begins with the air. Before someone tells a lie, their body has already started to retreat. Their eyes begin to avoid contact. Their tone shifts without them realizing. And if you're quiet enough, you'll hear those changes like an off-key soundtrack playing in a room that once felt calm. When you begin to see the truth, you don't need to do anything. Just be present, but that presence is no longer the old you, it's you, awakened. You no longer believe what they say. You no longer laugh on cue. You no longer react like a well-trained puppet responding to emotional gestures. And that subtle shift, though unspoken, disturbs them more than any confrontation. Truth disrupts artificial order, but it doesn't shout. It just stands there, like a quiet crack in the mirror that warps everything it reflects. The inauthentic sense it before you fully realize you've changed. They read your silence as betrayal, even though you haven't spoken a word. Because in their world where everything is controlled by speech and scripted emotions, any silence is a threat. You walk in, they greet you, everything appears normal, but then you notice they no longer meet your eyes for long. Their hands fidget, a gesture repeats too many times. A familiar line gets forgotten. A compliment stutters. A smile lingers longer than necessary. They don't know it, but you see it. And what unsettles them isn't your gaze, but that for the first time, you're truly seeing. Manipulators thrive when facing the innocent. They are performers on the stage of emotion, and you were the loyal audience, always crying on cue, clapping at the right moments. But now, you no longer believe the act. And even though you don't leave, don't confront, don't accuse, your changed gaze alone is enough to make them forget their lines. That strange energy doesn't come from one specific act. You can't film it, you can't present it in court, but it's real. And when you awaken, you don't need anyone to tell you something's wrong. You just know, through your spine. Through the growing distance between two people who were once close. Through the inexplicable heaviness in a once familiar space. Through the way they avoid your gaze while you no longer look away. Stoicism doesn't teach you to judge, but to observe without being consumed. You don't need to react. You don't need proof. You don't need to ask if they're upset, because what you're sensing isn't a thought, it's energy, and energy doesn't lie. In the early days after you know, you may feel a need to speak. You want them to know that you know. You want to name the feeling to get their confirmation that you're not crazy, not imagining, not overthinking, but then you realize you don't need them to validate what they fear most. you felt enough. Awakening comes with a foggy phase where you feel both sure and unsure of yourself. But take note, manipulators only act strangely when you're right. If you're still naive, they won't defend. If you still trust, they'll keep manipulating. But when you begin to see their true nature, they shift. Not because you did anything wrong, but because your seeing threatens the illusion they need to maintain. That's when you must choose. Either return to who you were, pretend you never saw, keep performing until your soul goes numb, or hold your silence but with awakened presence. You no longer cooperate in the lie. You show up like a mirror, and that alone makes them uncomfortable. The tension grows without words, because you're no longer easy to control. And manipulators fear only one kind of person, those they can no longer control. People often mistake silence for weakness, but silence after knowing, after seeing, is a form of quiet power. It makes the masked uneasy, because they can't predict your next move. And that unpredictability, that's what unsettles them most. This isn't advice to strike back, nor a cue to challenge. It's a reminder. Trust your sensing. Don't dismiss it just because you're afraid to face the truth. Don't let others make you question your own intuition, especially when the energy within you speaks louder than any word. Manipulators never react strongly to the weak. They only start to fear you when you no longer look away, when you no longer clap, when you stop asking out of politeness, when you no longer ignore the repetition of sweet but hollow words, when you step back not out of anger, but out of clarity. And from that moment, they emit a strange kind of energy. It's not that you're too sensitive. It's that they feel threatened by the way you now see. 2. They pile lies upon lies to cover the first one. There's a peculiar reaction you'll see in those who once manipulated you when the truth begins to surface. They don't go quiet to reflect, nor do they face you to take accountability. They don't understand what it means to turn around, because turning around means admitting they were wrong. And for a self-image built on control, admitting fault feels like destroying their throne. So they don't fix it, they patch it. First, it's an explanation that sounds reasonable. Then comes another story to support that explanation. Then a side detail, then a third-party name, then a conveniently invented scenario, all carefully arranged to reach one conclusion. They were never wrong. Everything gets rewritten, as if the original truth never existed. They step back from the edge of truth, but only to gather more materials to seal the cracks in the wall they built. The more you stay silent, the more they talk. The less you react, the more they embellish. They can't stand your silence because it reflects them. In it, they see their own unraveling. Every time you don't argue or accuse, they must face the fact that you no longer believe. And if you no longer believe, they lose their power. So they try to trap you in a new web of lies, thicker and stickier than ever. You start to feel something is off. Not because their words are wrong, but because there are too many of them. Honest people don't over-explain. They don't need to defend the same thing repeatedly. But liars patching lies can't stop. They fear silence, fear your growing clarity, fear the time you have to think. They create noise. They drown you in information. They confuse you with logic, not to help you understand, but to wear you out. That's how they regain control, not through force, not through threats, but through confusion. And if you're not grounded, you'll start doubting yourself. You'll wonder if you're too sensitive, if you misunderstood, if it's not as bad as you thought. But that's the trap. Because the more you doubt your own clarity, the further you drift from the truth you once saw so clearly. And that's what they want, to put you back where you were easily controlled. Deception never stands alone. It needs layers like a wound wrapped in dirty cloth instead of being cleaned. But torn cloth doesn't stop bleeding, and lies don't erase the footprints of truth. They only blur them temporarily until the truth erupts with greater force. Then you realize the danger isn't the first lie, it's the system of lies built to protect it. That's no longer a mistake. It's a strategy. And when deception becomes a strategy, you must understand you're no longer in a relationship. You're in a battle, not to fight, but to avoid being dissolved by that sophisticated illusion. Stoicism teaches us not to react impulsively, but non-reaction doesn't mean blindness. See clearly, when someone starts stacking stories to cover a previous one, what they fear most isn't your accusation, it's your awareness. But the deeper reason they keep lying isn't just to hide a mistake. It's bigger. It's fear of losing control. Manipulators don't live on truth. They live on the ability to shape how others perceive truth. When you start seeing clearly without their narration, that's not betrayal to them. It's a coup, and they'll do anything to reclaim the power to rewrite the narrative. What they fear isn't that you know what happened. What they fear is that you can tell the truth in your own words. In their eyes, truth isn't fixed. It's a puppet, dressed up, staged, and animated as long as they control the theater. But when you step down from the audience, into the light, and meet their eyes without guidance that's more threatening than any accusation. They don't react because they've been caught. They react because they've lost their role as director. That's when you see them change the script at breakneck speed. They contradict themselves. They redraw the backdrop. They retell the past with a new tone full of pain, sacrifice, and victimhood. They make themselves the one who suffered. You become the cold, heartless one, not to make you believe, but to reclaim center stage. Stoicism doesn't forbid dialogue, but it teaches you to choose what deserves your silence. And in this case, the strongest thing you can do isn't to argue. It's not to prove you're right. It's to remain silent with full understanding. Because truth doesn't need repetition, but someone losing control needs to retell it endlessly until you lose your direction and they regain center. You'll see confusion, defensiveness, and deflection dressed as care. You'll see sudden sweetness, unnatural finesse as if they're making peace. But don't be fooled. They're not here to heal. They're here to reclaim their role as the sole narrator of the story. They know if you stay lucid, they won't get to write another chapter. When you don't react, they'll raise their voice. When you don't waver, they'll change tone. When you no longer need an explanation, they'll find a way to make you feel guilty. And if you still remain centered, they'll turn to someone else with a new version where you're the villain. Because nothing scares them more than someone who once believed, now awakened without making a sound. That's when you understand. They're not afraid you've seen them. They're afraid you no longer need them to see. And in that loss of control, they'll reveal everything they once tried to hide. 3. They only appear when they need something from you. Some people enter your life not to stay, but to take what they need and then continue on their own path. Their presence was never a promise, let alone a partnership. It's more like a shadow that lingers just long enough to spark the hope of genuine connection, then vanishes once it's taken what it came for. And if you're clear-headed enough to observe, you'll notice the cold repetition. They only reach out when they lack something, when they're struggling, when they need a shoulder to lean on, a door to knock on, a hand to hold. Outside of those moments, they are completely absent, as if you never existed in the map of their life. The danger doesn't lie in what they ask of you, but in how they make you offer it willingly. They don't speak plainly, don't issue commands, and never admit that their presence is rooted in self-interest. Instead, they plant clever little stories, timely complaints, and glances that awaken your compassion. You believe you're being trusted, that you're special for being confided in, that your presence holds meaning, but the cold truth is this: you're merely supplying what they need while you think it's affection. The subtlety lies in how they never take too much at once. They know how to adjust the dosage, just enough so you don't feel used, but instead feel important. A thank you, a hug, a warm smile enough to convince you that this relationship is mutual. But in reality, the give and take only exists in your imagination. The take was calculated from the start. And once you're used to this cycle, you become a familiar stop, a place they know they can return to when all other resources run dry. The Stoics once reminded us, what matters is not how someone enters your life, but why they came. If their presence leaves you emptier than before, if every encounter brings more confusion than peace, if their timing always matches their own crises and never your needs, then what you're dealing with isn't affection, but agenda. And that agenda was never about you, it always revolved around their own gain. You might justify it by saying, at least you helped someone. But ask yourself, what kind of help nourishes both people and what kind only drains one side? A relationship not built on balance will never become a refuge. It turns into a sinkhole, gradually consuming your energy and goodwill. And the bitter truth is, the more you give, the more reason they have to return, not out of love, but because they know you haven't yet learned to close the door. In truth, their presence was never a gift. It was a signal, a reminder that kindness without boundaries becomes the key that opens the door for those driven purely by self-interest. And one day, you'll understand that real love never operates on a cycle of lack fulfillment, vanishing return. Real love doesn't wait until it needs something to knock. The cruelest irony is that you only see the truth when you have nothing left to offer. When you no longer serve as a life raft, when you're no longer a resource to be tapped, when you've given so much that there's nothing novel left to take, that's when they vanish. Without a goodbye, without explanation, they disappear cleanly, leaving a void that makes you wonder, was any of it even real? And then you remember they only appeared when they needed something. So now that they don't, their absence makes perfect sense. Their disappearance often lacks anger or drama. It's so quiet that you start to think you imagine the whole thing. They don't cut ties, they just stop connecting. Messages go unanswered, calls ring through, invitations fade. You realize they're still out there, still talking, still laughing, still caring for others. You alone have vanished from their orbit, and that silence speaks louder than 1,000 rejections. You've lost your value in their mental calculations. The most painful part isn't losing a relationship. It's realizing it never truly existed. If a connection survives only through utility, then the moment that utility ends, so does the connection. It was never friendship, never love, never companionship. It was a transaction disguised by smiles, sweet words, and hollow promises. And you realize, all this time, you didn't have a real friend. You were a resource, a stopgap, a means to an end. The Stoics once said, "What does not belong to you will be lost, no matter how tightly you hold it." A relationship built on selfish purpose never belonged to you. It belonged to them, to their needs, their calculations. You were a piece chosen when convenient and discarded when surplus. Accepting this truth is hard, but it's liberating. Because once you understand that their disappearance says nothing about your worth and everything about their character, you no longer have a reason to suffer. They vanish as if they never existed, but in that disappearance, you see more clearly who's genuine and who's not. Because real people don't vanish when you have nothing left to give. Real people stay for your presence, not your possessions. Real people come to you not in cycles of advantage, but in rhythms of sincere affection. The disappearance of those driven by purpose becomes the mirror that helps you cherish those who stay for no reason at all. And that's when you learn a key lesson in awareness. Losing someone who only came with an agenda is not a loss. It's the return of your freedom. It's your chance to stop pouring energy into hollow relationships. It's the first step to building boundaries, to being grateful for absence rather than resenting it. Because without that silence, you'd still be wasting your life in a game you never played. You were just a pawn moved by someone else. 4. They make you feel stupid. There's a kind of wound that's hard to name, not because it arrives with fury, but because it slips in during your most vulnerable moments. When you think you're opening up to be understood, when you pour your heart out hoping for empathy, that's when you're most exposed. And instead of receiving a quiet nod, a warm gaze, or a gentle word, you're met with cold questions. Why didn't you see this earlier? Everyone else saw it coming. How did you not? I can't believe you actually chose that. These aren't screams, but they strike directly at your dignity, making you feel foolish, incapable, and unfit to govern your own life. This is manipulation cloaked in concern. They don't yell. They don't belittle overtly. They take the trust you offered and turn it against you, causing your heart to shrink in self-doubt. The trap is that you believe their words come from care. You think they're trying to help you wake up, that maybe you're too sensitive for feeling insulted. But if you look closely, you'll see the colder truth. Those who truly wish to lift you speak the language of kindness. Those who wish to shrink you use the language of contempt masked as empathy. The difference lies in how you feel afterward. A sincere critique may sting for a moment, but it leaves you with direction and clarity. False empathy leaves behind a hollow pit of doubt. It doesn't strengthen you, it shrinks you. It leaves you weaker, more dependent on their wisdom. And that's how they control you, by making you believe you're too foolish to stand on your own, that you need them to guide every choice. The danger here isn't in the words, but in the intent behind them. Manipulators don't care if you're right or wrong. They care about keeping you uncertain. Because once you believe you're stupid, you'll seek their advice, beg for their approval, and second-guess your own instincts. In that moment, they have complete control. You become the follower, and they, the warped mirror you unknowingly use to define yourself. The Stoics taught, the mind is the only thing we truly own. If you lose that fortress, no enemy outside can bring you down because you've already opened the gate. The wake-up call is to learn the difference between true empathy and a velvet-wrapped blade. Ask yourself, after listening to them, do you feel stronger or just more ashamed? If it's the latter, then you understand. Because real empathy never turns a person small. Only deception does that. When these needles wrapped in concern pierce your pride, the wound isn't fleeting, it plants a seed of doubt. At first, you wonder, maybe I'm just too sensitive. Maybe I really was naive. Maybe I should have listened to them more. But then the doubts multiply. They cloud every choice. From minor decisions to major crossroads, you keep asking, am I just stupid? And in that moment, you've lost the most precious thing, the trust in yourself. Doubt is like an invisible shackle. It makes no sound, bears no weight, but binds tighter than chains. Every time you try to step forward, it pulls you back. Every time you want to speak up, it silences you with fear of ridicule. And slowly, no one has to remind you you're wrong, you do it yourself. You become the warden of your own mental prison, while the manipulator simply watches you lock the door. The irony is, you call that hesitation wisdom. You label it caution. You think it's a sign of maturity to listen, to stay humble. But there's a thin line between humility and self-doubt. Humility says, I might be wrong, but I'll still walk. Self-doubt says, I'm probably wrong, so I won't move at all. And that's the shadow the manipulator wants you to live in. They don't need to stop you, they just need you to believe every step you take is foolish. Then you'll stay still, waiting for them to decide. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Look within, there lies the fountain of strength, and it will always flow if you keep digging." But when you doubt yourself, you turn away from that source. You stop digging, you stop listening to your inner voice, and you start depending on theirs. That voice grows louder, yours fades. Until one day you realize you've lost your ability to trust your own instincts. The danger isn't in others making you feel stupid. The danger is in accepting it as truth. That's when the lock clicks without anyone holding the key. You trap yourself in a cage of imagined limitation, seeing the world through bars of doubt, believing that's all you're worth. But the truth is, the cage has no lock. The moment you rise, it falls. The moment you believe in yourself, their power evaporates. Stoicism teaches that the only true possession is the mind. As long as you guard that citadel, no one can diminish you no matter how they disguise their words. And once you learn to distinguish real empathy from invisible chains, you'll see you were never stupid. You just needed to remember how to trust yourself, how to hear the wisdom that was always there. And that is true freedom. Not freedom from others, but freedom from the doubt that once bound you. 5. They reinvent their image as if they've matured. There are those who, when exposed, do not choose sincere remorse, but instead put on a new mask. They change the way they speak, modify their behavior, even alter their appearance to create the illusion that they've learned a lesson and are now different. But that change is no more than a fresh coat of paint on a wall already rotting from within. From a distance, the bright colors may fool others into thinking it's a solid structure, but a single touch is enough to peel away the surface and reveal irreversible decay. What's dangerous is how easily we're deceived by that coat of paint because deep down, we want to believe that people can change. This belief in redemption makes the world seem less cruel. It feeds the hope that even those who once hurt us can become better versions of themselves. But this hope is exactly what manipulators exploit. They know how to touch your compassion, how to stage a few scattered signs of regret to trigger your sympathy. And the moment you start convincing yourself that perhaps they've truly changed, you also begin reopening a door that should have remained closed forever. The truth is, genuine growth does not seek to be seen, nor rush to justify itself. A truly changed soul reveals itself through steady actions, through the quiet acceptance of responsibility, through the absence of repeated mistakes. Meanwhile, those who only know how to perform will adopt fresh gestures and flashy promises, but it's all just decoration meant to maintain their place in your mind. Stoicism reminds us that a person's true value is found in what they repeat, not in what they stage for impact. Marcus Aurelius once wrote that the true nature of a person is shown in what they do often, not in what they do once to impress. When viewed with clarity, this so-called transformation isn't a step forward, it's a hasty patch. And that patch is nothing more than layers of torn fabric stacked atop one another. The more they pile on, the more the damage underneath becomes visible. Those who have never dared to confront the truth about themselves can never truly renew. And their attempts at reinvention are simply another form of avoidance. Epictetus once warned that no one can learn what they believe they already know. Those who delude themselves into thinking they've changed will never truly transform because the truth has never been touched. So when standing before someone who suddenly acts enlightened, don't rush to believe the paint. Watch time. Watch the repetition of their actions. Let patience be the test. A truly solid wall will withstand storms. A hastily painted one will collapse at the first rain. And when that collapse comes, you'll understand. The paint was never change, it was a desperate attempt to maintain control while the essence remained unchanged. If earlier we likened false change to a new coat of paint on a rotten wall, here the wall is no longer just painted, it has become a stage. The manipulator doesn't stop at concealing the rot. They go further, turning the idea of growth into a performance, a script meticulously crafted to preserve their control of the narrative. They know that if the truth can't be denied, it can at least be reshaped by steering your perception. And in that performance, you're not the audience. You're the puppet pulled along by lines already written. As they alter their image, you'll see strange new words, sweet gestures, expressions of regret that feel almost real. But pay attention, the timing is always perfect. These acts emerge right after they've lost your trust, as if designed to soothe your doubts. It's not quiet maturity. It's a spotlighted show aimed directly at you, hoping you'll believe they've become someone new. In reality, what they fear isn't the mistake being seen, it's the story getting out of their control. For if they can control the story, they can make you believe the wrongdoing was merely an accident, and that their current change is powerful evidence of redemption. This is where the real danger begins. Because once they've seized the narrative, you're no longer standing on truth, but on a script woven from half-truths. They will cry when needed, tell tragic tales to win sympathy, offer sweet promises to silence your suspicion. But as Seneca once wrote, those who feel no shame for their wrongdoing will never correct it. Their regret is a prop. Their growth is nothing but a costume meant to keep you invested in their illusion. If you remain clear-headed, you'll realize that real maturity needs no advertising. It moves in silence, in the quiet repetition of action, in small daily choices made when no one is watching. Those who truly grow never hurry to declare it, for they know only time and consistency can serve as proof. In contrast, manipulators act urgently. They need you to believe now so that the gap between their truth and their performance isn't exposed. Marcus Aurelius once wrote that the soul is dyed by the thoughts it repeatedly feeds. If they've truly changed, their soul will carry the colors of sincerity and awareness. But when you look closely, you'll see the shade doesn't last. It's just rushed makeup meant to deceive. And when that makeup fades, the same old face returns unchanged from the beginning. Remember, true growth is never an act. It is the quiet transformation of essence. A person who has truly changed doesn't need you to believe them immediately because they know that truth will stand on its own over time. But the one who merely performs needs your belief today because they fear their mask will fall tomorrow. And that is the clearest boundary between real growth and yet another act of manipulation. 6. They feign ignorance, as if nothing is happening. There's a chilling truth. When exposed, many don't choose to face it, nor to stay silent. They instead wear the mask of innocence as a shield. They know deceit can be recognized, but innocence is harder to confront. In the eyes of the world, innocence means harmlessness, ignorance, and therefore it's easily forgiven. So when cornered, they neither confess nor resist, but offer carefully measured lines like, "I didn't know you felt that way," or "If I really hurt you, that wasn't my intention." These words feel like apologies, yet sound like denial, and in that murky ambiguity, they perfectly evade responsibility. What's worse is that in that moment, you, the one who was hurt, suddenly become the one burdened with explaining, proving, clarifying what should have been obvious. Their false innocence makes you wonder if you're being too harsh, too sensitive, too fragile. You begin to doubt your own perception, and within that doubt, they regain a portion of power. This is the subtle game of a manipulator. They don't need to deny the truth. They only need to plant a seed of doubt, so you begin to deny yourself. From a Stoic perspective, this is a living example of the teaching. People are not disturbed by events, but by their judgments about those events. What hurts you is not their act of feigned innocence, but your willingness to let that act seep into your mind and shake your trust in what you clearly saw. If you stand firm, their pretense is nothing but a mist dissipating at first light. But if you let confusion grow, that mist becomes a nightfall, blinding you from truth and illusion alike. In truth, pretending to be innocent is a calculated tactic. It not only helps them escape accountability, it also forces you into the position of having to justify yourself. Instead of them apologizing, you feel compelled to apologize for misunderstanding. Instead of them explaining, you find yourself having to explain why you felt hurt. And once you step into that spiral, they've already won because you're no longer grounded in truth, but wandering a labyrinth of words where every phrase they use is crafted to make you question your own reality. Remember, real innocence needs no declaration. It reveals itself in the purity of action. But fake innocence always arrives on cue, like a curtain drawn just as the stage begins to crack. It isn't ignorance, it's cold strategy. And when you recognize it, you'll see their innocence isn't an excuse, it's a tool of manipulation. Epictetus once warned, "Do not let your mind be led like a child by others. Learn to see things as they truly are." Once you hold to this, no matter how many times they feign ignorance, responsibility remains undiminished. It sits there, heavy, unavoidable, awaiting the day it's laid bare. If feigned innocence is the shield to deflect responsibility, then playing the victim is the dagger used to twist the narrative. After shaking your resolve with ambiguous lines like, "I didn't know," they take a step further. They portray themselves as the one in pain, the one who's wounded, cleverly concealing the truth that they were the one who wounded you. In this game, your pain is no longer central, it is swapped out for theirs. And in that switch, the story flips, you become the villain, not the victim. This isn't genuine weakness, it's strategic theater. Lines like, "I didn't mean to," if that's how you feel, then I'm really sad, sound remorseful, but in truth, they're traps to put you on the defensive. You find yourself backing off, softening your tone, even feeling guilty for making them uncomfortable. The trap lies in your empathy. It's weaponized against you, twisted into a tool for them to regain control. And once you drop your anger to console them, the responsibility that once belonged to them quietly slips onto your shoulders. Stoicism foresaw these games centuries ago. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "People are quick to blame fate, yet rarely look within." Manipulators know this well, which is why they construct scripts where every wrong they commit is justified by circumstance, personal pain, unhealed wounds. And because we are raised to believe that those who suffer deserve compassion, we walk right into the web they've spun. The danger of their victim act lies in the distortion of essence. While you're busy tending to their false sorrow, you forget they were the source of your real wound. You bypass obvious truth to chase a rewritten story, and in doing so, you drift further from reality. From there, they regain the upper hand. They need not apologize, need not change, because now you believe it was your fault for not being more understanding. This is manipulation at its most refined, a reversal so profound it makes the victim willingly tie their own hands. But Stoicism reminds us, truth needs no defense, it simply is. Epictetus taught, others may insult you, but it is you who grants that insult power. Do not let someone else's performance redefine your reality. When they dress themselves in victimhood, don't look with pity. Look with clarity. Real pain doesn't need to be paraded, nor is it ever used to conceal responsibility. One who uses false wounds to avoid accountability is someone who never intended to heal, only to control through sympathy. And once you see this, you'll understand. Misplaced compassion is the fastest path to self-imprisonment. Rather than carrying the burden of their narrative, hold firm to the truth. Don't let your heart be led by tears that aren't born of remorse, but of calculation, because if you're not vigilant, your empathy becomes a chain and the manipulator, the one holding the key. 7. They manipulate you through false concern. There is a kind of care that does not arise from compassion, but from hidden agendas. It arrives gently, even sweetly, but instead of freeing you, it binds you with invisible strings. People ask how you're doing, they listen, they offer seemingly sincere advice, and in that moment you feel understood, protected. But soon, as you begin to feel comfort, that very comfort becomes the trap, because you gradually believe their presence is something you need, that you can hardly walk alone without their care. The manipulator knows well that emotional debt is the hardest kind to repay. A helpful gesture, a sympathetic question, a timely appearance all carve into you a lingering sense of obligation. From there, you become hesitant to object, reluctant to say no, and slowly your freedom begins to shrink without you even realizing it. Each act of kindness is like a loop of rope, loose at first, but tightening over time. You don't see yourself imprisoned, but you carry the weight of needing to comply, to behave, because you've been cared for so much. In truth, this is no longer care, it's an unspoken transaction. They give you what you lack, then quietly demand obedience, silence, or submission in return. What they call kindness is nothing more than a bribe, and you, unknowingly, have become the debtor. When you try to stand on your own, a voice echoes in your mind. Where would you be without them? That's when you realize you've been chained by threads too fine to see, yet too heavy to escape. The Stoics once reminded us that a gift is only a gift when it carries no expectation of return. When kindness turns into a tool of control, it loses its essence. Epictetus also warned, do not let your soul be enslaved by what others call favors. Because the moment you accept those ties, you've handed the key to your freedom into someone else's hands. And the irony is, you are the one holding the door of your own prison shut. True care liberates you, helps you grow, makes you more confident in yourself. But false care only makes you feel smaller, indebted, forced to live under someone else's shadow. Once you see the difference, you'll stop being fooled by rehearsed gestures. You'll understand that not every embrace brings warmth, not every act of concern comes from love. Some arms are only there to keep you inside a gilded cage. And when you're strong enough to see that truth, you'll learn to walk out, letting that false concern fall away like strings that no longer hold any weight. If false concern begins as hidden strings, then as it evolves, it becomes something more insidious, the planting of fear. Once you've grown accustomed to their care, the manipulator quietly changes tone. They no longer simply ask how you are, they begin to lace their words with warnings, doubts, and subtle hints that you're not strong enough to stand alone. Are you sure you can handle that? Or, I just worry you'll fail if you're not careful. These sound like sincere concern, but are really needles poking holes in your self-belief. And each of those needles, left unchecked, slowly drains the strength you already had. The danger of this type of care is that it's not direct. It doesn't strike head-on. It drips in slowly like water on stone. At first, you think it's love, protection, but over time, you realize you're trembling with every step, constantly needing their approval, always fearing that without them, you'll fall. That's no longer care, it's the planting of a false belief, that you are weak, that you need them, that you cannot exist without their shadow. And once that belief takes root, your freedom is stolen without your knowledge. Stoicism reminds us that fear only has power when we agree to host it in our minds. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "If something is beyond your control, it cannot hurt you unless you choose to let it." But here, false concern tricks you into thinking the fear lies within you, not something they've planted. And once you believe that, you become the one locking your own chains. Care was meant to liberate and uplift you, but in the hands of a manipulator, it becomes an invisible prison. We often think fear comes from overt threats or violent disruption, but the most dangerous fear arrives in gentle form. It comes as reminders, soft touches, advice spoken for your sake. And because of its tender disguise, we rarely question it. We rarely resist. Until one day, we find ourselves living in caution, afraid to step beyond the lines they've drawn for us. That's when care is no longer a gift, but a weight that causes you to shrink within your own life. Liberation only comes when you are alert enough to ask, why does care make me afraid instead of stronger? Why does each kind word cause me to doubt myself rather than trust who I am? And the answer, as Epictetus emphasized, lies in where you place your control. Outside, in the hands of others, or inside, within your own mind and will. Once you see this truth, you'll realize that care seeded with fear was never love. It was a power play. And that game ends the moment you dare to take the key back and open the door for yourself. Part 2. 8 Stoic principles to live by once you've awakened. 1. You don't need to explain anything. There is a paradox few are willing to accept. The more you try to explain, the more power you give to doubt. For explanations never stand alone. They stem from a defensive state, from the need to prove you're not wrong. And in doing so, you unconsciously validate the suspicion, lowering yourself to appease someone else's distorted perception. What sounds like transparency is, in truth, compromise, a retreat that turns truth into something negotiable. Manipulators know this well. That's why they never seek truth. They seek to keep you speaking so they can twist every word. They question not to understand, but to confuse, to distort, to push you into contradiction. The more you explain, the more fragments they collect to reconstruct the narrative in their favor. And you, in your desperation to be understood, become the architect of a false reality that benefits them. At that point, you're no longer defending truth. You're defending an ego already dragged into a pit of arguments. Marcus Aurelius once said, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." That reminder is liberating. It shows that truth requires no speech, only consistent action. Every explanation dilutes the strength of steadfast silence, while every unwavering action becomes irrefutable evidence. When we stand firm in truth, we need not convince anyone, for truth carries its own undeniable weight. Notice how explanations never end in peace. They invite more questions, more doubt, more verbal daggers. Like someone stepping into a swamp, the more they struggle, the deeper they sink. And when exhaustion finally sets in, that's when you realize you should never have stepped into the swamp in the first place. Doubt is not something to extinguish with words, but to expose with unwavering and silent presence. Epictetus once said, "If someone speaks ill of you, remember they're attacking an image, not your true self." Indeed, explanations only matter if the listener genuinely seeks to understand. But for those who twist the truth, every word becomes a blade turned against you. Freedom begins the moment you stop feeling obligated to explain. When you accept that doubt belongs to them, not to you, you reclaim your highest strength, tranquility. And in that tranquility, you realize that silence isn't weakness, it's a declaration without words. It says you refuse to play a game designed for you to lose. It says truth needs no defense, and doubt is unworthy of your inner peace. This is the strength of one who stands calmly in a storm, not shouting, not arguing, simply existing and letting time prove what words never could. Silence is not escape. It's the refusal to play a rigged game. When you choose silence, you are saying something far clearer than any speech. Truth doesn't need embellishment, and you don't need to lower yourself to argue with distortion. That silence is not helplessness, it is the strength of a soul that has learned to stand without needing outside approval. In many cases, it is precisely silence that unsettles the manipulator most. They crave your reaction, they want you entangled in the web of doubt, because every word you say feeds their spin. But when you give them nothing, no rebuttal, no plea, and continue calmly forward, you cut off the fuel of their power game. Seneca once wrote, "The wise man is not shaken by words, but defined by his own stillness." In that stillness lies real power, unseen, unspoken, yet enough to make others falter. Steadfast silence is not surrender, it's a deeper form of resistance. Rather than fight in the mud, you build a fortress where no attack can touch you. You continue to live by your values, to work, to walk forward, and in that stability lies undeniable proof that rumors, distortions, or doubts never reached your essence. It is a resistance without sound, but solid as stone until even the foulest winds fade. The hardest part of steadfast silence is not keeping your mouth shut, but keeping your heart steady. Inside, there's always a voice urging you to speak, to prove, to clear your name. But when you learn to quiet that urge, you train the highest human strength, self-mastery. Epictetus emphasized that true freedom doesn't come from doing whatever you want, but from not being forced to do what you don't want. And here, silence is freedom. It is the refusal to let others dictate your emotions and actions. Time will accomplish what words never can. It reveals truth and erodes lies. When you remain silent and firm, you place your trust not in the frailty of speech, but in the endurance of reality. Those who truly see you will recognize your essence. Those clinging to illusions will expose their own shallowness. In the end, truth won't need your protection, it will stand on its own, because you refuse to be pulled into an endless game of defense. Steadfast silence is the highest form of strength, not just control over your words, but over your entire inner world. It declares that you have chosen peace over pride, truth over theater, and freedom over the chains of suspicion. And in the moment you walk silently through that storm, you have already won, not against others, but against the weaknesses within yourself. 2. You don't need to prove you're right. There's a paradox that traps many people their entire lives. The more desperately we try to prove we're right, the more we turn truth into something that needs acceptance, rather than a foundation that stands on its own. When you rush to offer evidence, arguments, or witnesses in your defense, you've already conceded that the truth is missing something, that it's not solid enough without external validation. But truth, by its nature, needs no defense. It exists independently, like light that shines without being pointed at, like a flame that warms without requiring approval. The Stoics saw this clearly. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "If something is right, it will stand. If something is wrong, it will fall." A simple truth, yet profoundly liberating. When you begin to trust that endurance, you're no longer pulled into cycles of debate or tormented by the need to prove every detail. You learn to stand still within truth, like an unmoving rock amid crashing waves, letting every accusation break against you and dissolve. Truth needs no shouting. It needs patience, because time is its greatest ally. Think back to the times you scrambled to prove you weren't wrong. Every explanation, every piece of evidence, every desperate justification felt like drops of blood, draining your energy. And in the end, you realized those who want to believe you don't need much, and those who don't will only look for more reasons not to. In that realization, you learn a costly truth. Truth doesn't need a lawyer. It needs a silent witness, and that witness is your daily life, repeated consistently, so relentlessly that no one can deny it. Epictetus once said, "If someone speaks ill of you, remember they are attacking a version of you they imagined, not who you really are." That line is a door to freedom. Because when you stop trying to prove you're right, you free yourself from the distorted image others have created of you. You let them live in their illusion while you live in your truth. And that truth, over time, becomes the wall that separates you from the meaningless noise. Truth doesn't need vindication, because vindication is born from fear. The fear of being misunderstood, the fear of losing face, the fear of no longer holding value in the eyes of others. But once you remove that fear, freedom reveals itself. You no longer need others to believe your truth for it to exist, because it already does. And when you stand within that truth, you become untouchable. Not because others can't attack you, but because those attacks no longer penetrate your mind. The moment you step away from the need for vindication, you also step away from the chains of public opinion. You stop living to be believed and start living to be real. And that truth, expressed in silence, in consistency, in action, becomes a louder testimony than any words could offer. It proves that truth needs no vindication because it is its own defense. When you've let go of the need to be proven right, you discover a deeper layer of freedom, the release from the invisible chain called proving. Because not everyone realizes this. The more you try to prove yourself, the more you become a prisoner of others' perceptions. The more you speak, explain, defend, the more you give away your autonomy. And worse, you stop living for the truth and start living for the approval of those who never truly listened. This chain isn't made of iron, but it clings just as tightly like those anxious thoughts looping endlessly in your mind. Do they believe me? What are they thinking about me? How can I make them understand? These questions never stop because they have no final answer. They keep spinning, wearing down your inner strength. And while you're busy proving, you lose what truly matters, the stillness of your heart, the integrity of your actions, the peace within. Stoics didn't seek safety in the eyes of others, they sought clarity in how they lived. Epictetus emphasized, when you place your self-worth in external validation, you hand over the keys to your freedom. That's when you become a puppet controlled by glances, comments, and carefully wrapped lies. You're no longer living, you're only reacting, and one who reacts is never in control. One who reacts is always tired because they don't know when that validation will be enough. The more you try to prove yourself, the more you trap yourself in a loop. Prove, be doubted, prove again. And this loop has no end. Because those who believe you don't need you to speak, and those who don't never have enough evidence to be convinced. So proving is not an act of serving truth, it's a reflex born of lacking trust in yourself. When you know who you are, when you live in alignment with what you believe, the strongest proof isn't in your words, but in the long-term consistency between what you say and what you do. True freedom begins the moment you start removing those invisible chains from your mind. Every moment you choose silence over explanation, action over argument, forward motion over standing still in debate is a moment you unlock yourself. And one day, you'll look back and realize that the things which once robbed you of sleep now carry no weight compared to the peace you hold. Not because others finally believed you, but because you no longer needed them to. This is a kind of freedom no one can give you and no one can take away. When you are no longer driven by the urge to prove you're right, you are not just stronger, you are untouchable. And in that untouchability, you finally begin to live not to be seen, but to fully be yourself, in your most complete and undivided form. 3. You don't need to tear off their mask. Beneath the perfect facade someone tries to wear, there is always something that doesn't align with reality. A glance that feels out of place, a gesture that seems forced, a sentence that doesn't come from where life truly resides within them. And in time, those elements begin to crack. No matter how meticulously rehearsed, pretense cannot survive long in contact with real life. Because a person's true nature is not found in what they want others to see, but in what they cannot hide forever. And at some point, that mask will no longer hold. It will fall not in a dramatic scene like in the movies, but quietly, in moments when they can no longer contain their inner contradictions. It's when they say one thing, but their eyes wander towards something else. When they display kindness but avoid direct eye contact. When they insist they've changed, but their old patterns bleed through the cracks in their voice. The mask doesn't fall because you force it, it falls because it can no longer withstand the weight of real life. And ironically, it falls at the very moment they most need it to stay on when they're trying to protect their reputation, preserve a relationship, or prove a level of self-awareness they've never actually reached. The Stoics saw no need to expose others because they trusted the patience of time and the consistency of human nature. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Character reveals itself no matter how long you try to hide it." With that conviction, you don't need to speak out to accuse, slam the table to make a point, or drag someone into the crowd to pass judgment. You simply stay still and observe, because when truth arrives, it needs no words. It's powerful enough to touch everything false and make it dissolve without a sound. You've likely witnessed this moment before. Someone desperately explaining why they've changed, why they're different now, why you should trust their growth. But woven into their every word is something they can't cover up: the fear of being found out. And fear is the first sign they haven't truly changed. Someone who has genuinely grown doesn't need your belief they live in a way that makes you see it. But someone still acting always needs your approval to keep the performance alive. And then, just when they most need that mask to protect their last image, their inner conflict shatters it. No one pulled it off, but it still fell. And when you witness that moment, don't applaud, don't sneer, don't count it as a victory. Walk away. Because the performance didn't end because you were a sharp observer, but because falsehood cannot survive in real air. And the Stoic doesn't stay to dissect, ridicule, or gloat. They do one thing: leave the stage with silent dignity as someone who knows who the other truly is, but doesn't need to reveal it to validate their own worth. There comes a moment when you realize exposing the truth is no longer your mission, not because truth doesn't matter, but because you no longer need it to be recognized through noise. Because ultimately, what gives truth its weight is not that it's shouted in the crowd, but that it stands quietly in action, in outcomes, and in the self-revealing contradictions of the false. When the mask falls, you don't need to shout, "I knew it," because the moment it hits the ground is the moment everyone sees what you've long kept silent. Dignity needs no performance. It doesn't come from proving you were right, nor from winning the moral argument. Dignity is born in how you choose not to become like them, not using tricks to flip the narrative, not exposing them for revenge, not dragging them onto a stage to bask in applause because you were right. You choose to withdraw, to be silent, to take a position away from the spotlight because you understand that truth only holds value when it is not tainted by the need for revenge. And only in that calm can truth remain clean, not distorted by personal motives, not soiled by pride's need to win. Epictetus once said, "When you see a man revealing himself, the best thing you can do is not interfere with the process." You don't need to speed it up. You don't need to twist the events to reach a quicker conclusion. You only need to keep yourself upright and step back. In that retreat, you preserve your balance, your principles, your peace, something no one can steal from you. And strangely, that silence echoes louder than any accusation. People may forget what you said, but they will never forget how you stood wordless, still while everything around you fell apart. Because when truth is revealed at the right time, it doesn't need thunder. It carries its own weight. It holds its own depth. And what makes truth trustworthy isn't who says it, but how they lived before and after it was revealed. The Stoic doesn't believe in the fairness of the crowd, but in the enduring value of character. That's why they don't need to create drama. They just need consistency. No revenge, no slander, no victory built on someone else's fall. They simply hold their dignity long enough for truth to speak on their behalf. To reveal truth with dignity is to let what's right come into light without turning yourself into an instrument of disorder. That's the greatest power you can retain after losing trust, losing time, even losing someone you once loved. But if you can keep your dignity when the truth breaks open, then you haven't lost yourself. And perhaps, in the end, that's the only thing that still matters. 4. You don't need to save that relationship. There were nights when you lay in silence in the dark, trying to name what was slowly decaying in a relationship you couldn't walk away from, even though everything in your heart had stopped believing. You searched for reasons to stay. You convinced yourself that things would get better, that just one more act of forgiveness, a bit more patience, one last chance would bring everything back to how it used to be. But deep down, a voice kept knocking. You're fighting against yourself. Because what you're holding on to is not a healthy bond, but an illusion you've created to avoid facing the truth that it's been broken for a long time. Effort is a beautiful thing, but only when it doesn't cost you your sense of self. A relationship should not be a war between kindness and pain. It should not be a place where you walk on eggshells, afraid to speak your truth, afraid to feel what you feel for fear of being called too sensitive, too demanding, or worse, the one causing problems. If being with someone means you must constantly adjust, shrink, and distort your emotions just to keep the peace, then it's no longer a relationship. It's a gilded cage where you are imprisoned by your own affection. Marcus Aurelius once said, "What is contrary to nature cannot last." A relationship that forces you to betray your intuition, suppress the truth, and forget your self-respect, even if it looks peaceful on the surface, is silently eroding your deepest self. And the saddest part isn't that the other person doesn't understand you, it's that you are making yourself understand and accept what should never be forgiven. That's when you stop being a companion in the relationship and become the one sustaining it at all costs, even at the silent expense of your dignity. Some things, the more you try to hold on, the more they make you lose your way. Some people, the more you try to save, the more you lose yourself. The Stoics don't teach you to abandon others, but they always remind you, never abandon yourself for someone else. You can forgive, you can give chances, you can be patient, but if it becomes a never-ending loop, then patience is no longer a virtue, it becomes self-deception. And every time you stay silent to keep the peace, every time you take the blame just to end a conflict, every time you tell yourself, maybe I'm just too sensitive, you chip away parts of yourself to patch up a relationship that no longer deserves you. Fighting yourself to hold on to someone is trading truth for hope. But hope cannot save what's already dead. It only makes your suffering last longer. So if your exhaustion doesn't come from what they've done, but from no longer recognizing yourself when you're with them, that's when you need to stop. Not to give up, but to stop betraying the only person you're truly responsible for protecting, yourself. There's something strange about how we are taught to hold on, but rarely taught how to let go. We view leaving as failure, endings as misfortune, stopping as surrender. And because of that, many people stay in places they no longer belong, not out of love, but because they don't want to be seen as the one who gave up. But only when you're clear-eyed enough to look back at your journey will you understand. Sometimes letting go is not giving up. It is the quietest, strongest declaration of someone who refuses to betray themselves any longer. Letting go is choosing dignity over hollow promises. It is choosing self-respect over pleasing others. It is choosing to keep what is still intact in you, your trust, your sincerity, your heart, that once loved fully, rather than continuing to trade it all for something the other person never truly valued. Some departures don't need anger, don't need tears, don't need explanations. Just a simple truth. You've given enough, tried enough, understood enough, and now you must preserve yourself. The Stoic does not measure strength by their ability to defeat others, but by their ability to control themselves and know when to walk away. Seneca once said, "No one loses more than the one who tries to hold on to what should have been let go." Because what binds us is not love, but attachment to an old version of ourselves, the one who once believed that trying a bit harder would change everything. But the only thing that truly changed was you, and not for the better. You became smaller, more tired, more doubtful, and hurt yourself a little more each day. Not because the other person changed, but because you didn't dare to. Letting go doesn't need dramatic declarations. Sometimes it's just a gentle nod, a quiet step, a calm gaze, and a sentence. I understand. No blame, no hatred, no need to prove you were right. Just the realization that you've seen enough not to ask for more, felt enough not to cling any longer, and in that departure, you don't leave a void, you simply close a door that no longer leads to where you want to go. Maybe they won't understand. Maybe no one will take your side, but that no longer matters. Because the moment you choose peace over familiarity, self-respect over empty promises, closure over meaningless continuation is the moment you grow in the truest sense. Not as the one who wins an argument, but as the one strong enough to walk away in silence, carrying the last fragments of pride. And then, you'll look back not with regret, but with the stillness of someone who knows. Letting go didn't make you weaker. It was the only way not to lose yourself. 5. You don't need to wait for them to change. There are things you can't clearly see from inside a relationship. Only when you step outside do you realize how deeply you've deceived yourself. You didn't deny the truth on purpose. You simply tried to believe that the love you gave was enough to change someone. You thought that if you were gentler, more patient, more understanding, they would stop hurting you. But you forgot one thing. No one changes just because they are loved more than they deserve. People only change when they themselves decide to. Expectations can destroy the clarity within you. You start coloring reality. You justify their wrongdoing with sweet reasons they never actually said. You project onto them a version you hope they will become, and then feel disappointed when they continue being who they are. But they aren't the one at fault. The fault is yours for placing hope in something unreal. You didn't love them as they were, but loved the version you imagined. And in doing so, you didn't love a person, you loved an illusion. Seneca once said, "A wise person never ties themselves to what is uncertain." Yet you used all your emotional energy to tether your soul to a vague possibility that they might change. Not because they promised, but because you needed a reason to stay. You needed hope to make your continued suffering feel less meaningless. But the truth is, every form of patience has its limit, and hope placed in the wrong hands eventually becomes betrayal, not from them, but from you to yourself. Change never comes from pity, nor from how much you sacrifice. It comes when someone has the courage to face the darkness within themselves and chooses to grow. If they are not ready to do that, then all your efforts are ladders leaning against a wall with no door. The more you try to climb, the more lost you become. And the saddest part is not that they didn't change, but that you turned yourself into someone who no longer recognizes their own limits. Letting go of expectations is not the death of kindness. It is the wisdom born from experience. You no longer try to control others, no longer hinge your happiness on their transformation. You accept them for who they truly are, and you choose to walk away if that person no longer aligns with your path. That is not failure. It is clarity. It is the first step out of the cycle of hope and hurt, back to a simple truth. Not everyone wants to get better, and you are not responsible for that. What exhausts you is not who they truly are, but what you keep hoping they will become. When expectations for change become the anchor keeping you in a harmful relationship, then letting go of those expectations is your first act of freedom. Not freedom from them, but freedom from yourself, the one who has been locked in hope for too long. Ironically, what sets you free is not another hand opening the door, but you no longer waiting for someone to do it. You believe that if they could just recognize their faults, change their attitude, learn to love you the right way, you'd be happy again. But what you were really doing was handing the key to your inner peace to someone who doesn't understand its value. You conditioned your tranquility on someone else's actions, placing the fate of your emotions in the hands of an outsider. And every time they fell short of your expectations, you shattered again. Not because they were too cruel, but because you had appointed them as the main character in your healing journey. Marcus Aurelius once said, "You have the power to retreat into yourself whenever you need. Nowhere is more peaceful or more free than your own soul." The liberation you seek does not lie in an apology, a change, or redemption from the other person. It lies in your decision to step out of the land of expectations where you once waited for them to save you and return to the land of self-mastery where you are the one holding the wheel. Because expectations are a form of dependence, but letting go of expectations, that is mature freedom. When you no longer expect them to change, you begin to see them clearly, not as who you want them to become, but as who they truly are. The truth may be cold, but it will never mislead you. On the contrary, it gives you a firm ground on which to make a choice, to stay or to walk away. And when you leave, not because they're terrible, but because you've released the idealized image in your mind, that's a departure without resentment. That is how you preserve your dignity in silence. People often say forgiveness is the highest form of love. But in many cases, relinquishing expectation is the purest act of self-respect. Because to stop waiting for someone to change, you must be strong enough to face the disappointment and steady enough to not place blame. You simply move forward with clarity that they have the right to be who they are, and you have the right to choose a path without them. When you no longer hope for others to change, you don't become closed off. On the contrary, you open a new door, a space where your emotions are no longer postponed. Your mood is no longer dictated by someone else's behavior, and you no longer force yourself to endure another person's winter just to prove you deserve spring. You simply return to being your own master, not for anyone, not for hope, but because you've realized liberation is an internal decision. It never needs anyone's permission. 6. You don't need to react emotionally. Not everyone who hurts you deserves sharp words in return. Some people only need you to stay silent at the right moment, say one sentence that hits their weakness, or simply step back, and you've already exposed your inner turmoil. That's when you don't respond from awareness, but from emotion, from the fear of abandonment, from wounds not yet healed, from the need to prove something. And the moment you react like that, you've handed them exactly what they wanted, a remote control for your emotions placed directly in their hands. Emotional reactions are instinctive, but in life, instincts are not always right. Sometimes you get angry not because they were wrong, but because your pride was wounded. Sometimes you feel ashamed not because they insulted you, but because you're carrying hidden guilt. Your emotions are easily disturbed, not because others are powerful, but because your inner world is not yet at peace. And each time you let emotions lead, you give someone else the power to decide who you'll be the attacker, the victim, or the loser in a confrontation you didn't need to join. Marcus Aurelius once said, "True strength is keeping your mind steady when others are losing theirs." Anger is not a sign of strength. Emotional outbursts don't prove authenticity. Expressing emotions unconsciously only shows how easily you're provoked, led, and manipulated. And so, while you think you're reacting to reclaim justice, in truth, you're playing right into the hands of someone who wants you to lose control. The louder your reaction, the more they stay calm and the more you fall into a disadvantage. Some manipulators don't need to raise their voice. They only need to stand still because they know you'll self-destruct. They just need to prod a memory you haven't healed, a wound you tried to hide, a fragile part of yourself you won't admit. And that's when you react. You lose your composure. You act impulsively. You say things that later torment you, not because you were wrong, but because you weren't in control of yourself. Reacting emotionally gives others the power to define who you are in that moment. They speak, you shout. They leave, you beg. They remain silent, you keep explaining. In that game, you're always on the losing side. And the frightening thing is, after each of those moments, you feel smaller, more confused, more disoriented while they lose nothing at all. Self-control doesn't mean apathy. Self-control means knowing what you feel, but not letting emotion dictate your actions. It means knowing you're hurt, but not reacting like someone weak. It means understanding that silence is sometimes a way of refusing to let someone else step into your inner world and throw it into chaos. After every emotional reaction, what remains is not relief but emptiness. Emptiness from having drained all your energy trying to prove you are right, trying to protect a fragile position, trying to hold on to a respect that no longer exists. But composure is different. Composure doesn't drain you because it doesn't demand resistance, doesn't depend on winning or losing, and doesn't rely on being understood by others. Composure is when you stand in the storm, knowing it cannot touch the deepest part of you unless you allow it. The manipulator hopes you lose your temper. They wait for your anger. They hope for your meltdown. Because once you break, it's easier for them to rewrite the story in their favor. But if you stay calm, not because you're blind or numb, but because you choose not to react, then you've already won. Not over them, but over yourself. Because only those truly strong have the courage not to act on impulse, but to live by principle. The courage to not need the last word, not to shout to be heard, not to act just to silence the fire inside. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Calm is the weapon of a steadfast mind." It's a kind of power that cannot be seen, cannot be measured, but forces others to hesitate. Because when you don't react, they lose their grip on the narrative. When you're silent, they're forced to hear the echo of their own voice. When you don't retaliate, they have nothing to justify their wrongdoing. And then, your calm becomes the harshest mirror of their chaos. Not through words, not through actions, but through your complete lack of response. Calmness doesn't come from indifference. It comes from the deep understanding that no one can define you unless you allow it. No one can make you lose control unless you forget who you are. And no one can control the story unless you hand them that role. In a world full of noise, where everyone demands to be heard, to be proven right, to be seen, the one who chooses silence may be the only one truly listening to themselves. Calmness is not retreat. It's the refusal to enter a battle that isn't worthy. No need to explain, because misunderstanding doesn't lessen your real value. No need to argue, because truth doesn't need a defender. No need to prove, because what's right will stand on its own. And no need to react, because sometimes outer stillness reflects the deepest inner clarity. When you can remain calm amid chaos, you're not just protecting yourself from pain. You're making a clear statement. I alone decide who has access to my mind and who does not deserve to touch it. 7. You don't need to silence your pain. There are wounds that cannot be erased simply by pretending they never happened. They don't disappear when you smile, nor do they fade when you go on living as if you were never hurt. On the contrary, the more you hide them, the louder they speak. They don't scream, but they bleed quietly through unconscious choices, through unexplainable reactions, through the way you build walls against people who've done nothing wrong. And then you call it, "I've changed." But in truth, it's only "I've shrunk," because once you weren't allowed to feel pain. People are often taught how to endure, not how to face. You're praised for being strong when you hide your tears, when you work as if nothing happened, when you smile as if your heart has never been shattered. But that strength, if not paired with inner honesty, is just a mask. And the longer you wear it, the more you forget what your real face looks like. Stoicism doesn't encourage you to deny your feelings. It teaches you to understand them. Marcus Aurelius never said, "Stop hurting," but rather, look at pain as part of nature, like rain, like wind. Like winter, it comes, it goes. And you are still yourself if you don't resist that law. Acknowledgement doesn't make you weak. It gives you a chance to heal authentically, from within, without borrowing comfort or validation from outside. Owning your pain is an act of courage. It's the moment you look directly at the old wound without flinching, without trying to dress it up. You call it by its name. Betrayal, loss, disappointment, injustice. And then you let go of the urge to blame, let go of the need to prove that you've moved on. You just look at it to realize that it no longer has power over you. And in that gaze, calm, unjudging, you reclaim the sovereignty of your mind. No one needs to know how badly you once broke, but you need to know how you stood back up. No one can teach you how to move on if you're still locking your heart away, pretending it was never hurt. And no healing journey ever begins with denial. Every path to inner freedom starts at one point, daring to admit that you've been hurt, and that doesn't make you weaker. It makes you real. After you've dared to face the pain, the next step is not to strain yourself, proving you've overcome it. Because real healing never comes from making others believe you're fine. It comes from radical honesty with yourself, that you still feel, that you still remember sometimes, that there are mornings you wake up and something unnamed still lingers in your chest. And that doesn't make you weak. It makes you honest. We live in a fast-paced world where people want to move past pain as quickly as possible, where strength means being okay immediately. But the healing of the soul cannot be rushed like a race. There is no deadline for healing, no timestamp after which you must be back to normal. And if you hurry to return to life, you're only suppressing what needs to be heard until one day it speaks through unexpected places, in sudden anger, in unexplainable coldness, in the emptiness you can't name even when someone is beside you. Healing is not about constructing a new image for others to believe you've changed. Healing is being able to sit with your past without covering it up. It's being able to look back on what happened and feel no hatred, no need to be vindicated. It's not needing to say, "I'm okay" to anyone simply because you no longer need to say it. Because you know, and that's enough. Epictetus once said, "It's not others who make you suffer, it's you who gives them the power too." But what few mention is that power is not reclaimed merely through toughness, but through honesty with the feelings you once had. Because when you can say, "I was hurt and I'm not ashamed of that," only then does the journey through it truly begin. Not because others deserve forgiveness, but because you deserve freedom. You don't need to share that journey with the world. You don't need to post it online, don't need to explain it to anyone. Don't need to turn your pain into a lesson for display. Some things, once quietly acknowledged in your consciousness, lose their grip entirely. Some chapters, once you walk through them without pretending, are already behind you, and some kinds of healing require only one thing: honesty with yourself, even if no one else understands. 8. You don't need to become who you used to be. There will be days when you remember your old self, the one who was more cheerful, more naive, more trusting, and who loved as if they had never known pain. That person once saw the world with clear eyes, once believed that sincerity alone would earn sincerity in return. But one day the world stopped being as gentle as you believed. Subtle cuts from the people you valued most sharpened your heart. You're no longer who you used to be, not because you've lost anything, but because you now see more clearly, more deeply, and more soberly. And then someone tells you you've changed, that you're no longer the same, no longer easy to approach, no longer easily swayed or persuaded. They say it as if it's something that needs fixing, but they don't know what you had to go through to become who you are now. How many disappointments you had to survive, how many times you forgave the wrong person, how many relationships you held on to just to preserve a false sense of warmth. You're no longer your old self, not because you've grown bitter, but because you've learned to protect yourself in silence, through choices, and even through refusals that require no explanation. Returning to who you were is sometimes a longing born of nostalgia, but it can also be a trap of denial. Because if you had to pay for your clarity with countless falls into the depths of disappointment, then forcing yourself to become the person who once lived blindly is a betrayal of the very lessons written into your bones. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The cost of maturity is the loss of innocence." And if you've crossed that threshold, then turning back is no longer the path of a free soul, it's the retreat of someone unwilling to take responsibility for their awakening. We often think of our old self as something beautiful that was lost. But sometimes that beauty was only an illusion woven from ignorance. That old self once let others define their worth, once measured love by kindness alone, and once clung to places they should have walked away from. You may mourn that version of you, but you don't need to become them again. Because true peace isn't found in a gentle memory, but in your ability to live honestly as who you are now. The one who understands that kindness must not be given blindly, trust must not be misplaced, and love cannot survive without respect. Holding on to yourself in a world full of pressure is hard. But refusing to revert to your old self to not betray the lessons learned through your own downfalls, that is courage. And it is the first step on a journey of growth that requires pleasing no one but your own conscience. There will be people who look at your new self and feel discomfort, not because you've done anything wrong, but because you're no longer easily hurt. You no longer bend, no longer stay quiet to keep the peace, no longer ignore what must be confronted. You begin setting boundaries. You begin saying no. You begin walking away from places that make you feel small in your own life. And then they demand an explanation, an apology, some way to coax you back into being the version of you who once bowed and accepted. But you owe no one an apology for growing. You don't need to prove anything, nor do you need to explain why you no longer accept what once caused you pain. Your new self, calmer, deeper, more direct, is the only answer they need. Because you didn't change to rebel against anyone. You changed to finally stand with yourself. And in that process, you don't need noise. You don't need confrontation. You don't need to win with arguments. You just need to exist rightfully and peacefully among those who once got used to controlling you. The silence within you now is not surrender. It is the echo of a soul that has weathered storm. You understand now that no one truly changes by being forced to, and no one needs to apologize for refusing to live as a shadow. Keep your kindness, but don't be careless. Keep your calm, but don't submit. Keep a version of yourself that you can look at and feel proud of. That is all you need. And if someone demands an apology for becoming someone who loves themselves more, who knows how to reject manipulation, who knows when to walk away from toxicity, then your silence is your most powerful response. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you know. A version of you that lives honestly, deeply, and with boundaries needs no defense. It speaks for itself. It clarifies itself. It stands on its own without needing anyone's approval. I once held on to a relationship simply because I thought I should be forgiving. I once stayed silent and endured, just so I wouldn't become the villain in someone else's story. But the truth is, every time I tried to preserve something already broken, I was stepping further away from myself. I began to realize I was no longer the person who forgave easily out of fear of losing someone, but someone who had learned to walk away in order not to lose themselves. Not everyone who changes grows. Not everyone who smiles is sincere. And not everyone who seems to need you truly values you. Freedom doesn't come from others treating you well, it comes from knowing your own limits and never compromising with anything that violates them. I don't write these words to teach anyone anything. I just want to say, if you find yourself becoming calmer, more decisive, more unpredictable, and quieter than maybe, just maybe, you're heading in the right direction. If you feel these words speak to something deep within you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell not because you need it, but as a daily reminder. You once chose stillness, and you will choose it again. Because in the end, your silence is not weakness, it is a sword forged in fire. No one sees it, but everyone feels it. I'll see you in the next video.